Hello, everyone. Welcome back to coverage of the 2024 United States presidential election on Point Park Television. My name is Carson Brunn. I am the president of the Bridge USA chapter here at Point Park University. Today, I am joined by the assistant professor of history at Point Park University, Dr. Josh Wolf. Thank you for sitting down with me today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me, Carson.
We will be discussing the history of elections and the history of voting and some other things as well. I want to get started with something that because I'm a student of yours this semester, something that you said to our class in the beginning, which I've been thinking about a lot, was you, and paraphrasing here, but you said, no matter what we talk about in this class, no matter how dark it gets, don't let yourself be consumed by cynicism. And I thought that was an interesting thing. Have you struggled with cynicism in your life as a historian?
I think it's something that, as you study the human condition, as you study whether it's the history of the we'll just stick with the history of the United States since it is U.S. history that I have you for class in. You know, we often have these expectations of what we think our country is, what we think our ideals are, what we think we're striving for collectively as a people. And well, history isn't only the study of failures, it's the study of both failures and successes. When you confront the failures that the United States has experienced and how self-inflicted many of them have been, it can lead you to the conclusion that what's the point in any of this? Nothing ever changes, nothing ever improves, nothing ever gets better. So why are we pretending like we're engaged in any kind of democratic process at all? On a personal level, I do think cynicism has a certain attraction to young people in particular. My first presidential election that I got to participate in was the 2020 election. I had a very cynical attitude about both of the parties in that election. I didn't think Al Gore was any kind of adequate replacement for the Clinton project that had been undertaken. I didn't see anything in George W. Bush that qualified him intellectually to be president of the United States. I just didn't think, and I ended up in an act of cynicism voting third party. In hindsight, George W. Bush, he might not be an intellectual, but he's a lot savvier, I think, than a lot of people gave him credit for in 2002 and 2004. Al Gore, I've warmed to Al Gore a lot over the last 24 years in a way that I was much more closed about. So yeah, it's been something that I've. But I actually think being a historian in some ways has helped me overcome that because, well, it is very easy to be cynical about the mistakes that have been made in the past. One of the advantages of historical inquiry is that we do take this long view, and you see how things have improved. Maybe not always as quickly or as radically as some people think they should change or they should get better. But I do think in many ways the history of the United States is the history of steady improvement, of opening American society to more people, to more voices, to greater participation. And that's a very uncynical thing, right? I think historical inquiry helps with that. It helps offset that. But again, sometimes it's what you choose to focus on, right? Mm-hmm. But even in the darkest times, you can find beautiful moments, right?
Yeah. What would you say right now, if not to put like undue pressure on you, but if you were to if the American people were listening, if I gave you like the FDR, the fireside chat radio, and what would you say to those people right now that are in some sense, consumed by fear or anxiety or cynicism that this country is going in a bad direction, and it doesn't seem, some of these solutions seem so, some of the problems seem so large, the solutions seem so difficult to orchestrate. What would you say to those people if you would say anything?
Well, since you mentioned FDR, I guess one of the first things I might do is just steal a line right from FDR,
Sure.
right? We have nothing to fear but fear itself. The obstacles that the United States is facing today, sure, they seem daunting, but the United States has faced many-headed Hydra in the past and been able to overcome those challenges. Most notably, the dual. Really, more than two. You've got the Dust Bowl tragedy, you've got the Great Depression, and you've got the rise of fascism, all unfolding at the exact same time. And the United States is deeply involved in all of these processes, right? It is difficult. It takes time. It creates controversy. But the United States figured out how to work our way through the Dust Bowl. We recovered from the Great Depression. We defeated international fascism. All of those things were able to happen through the collective efforts of the American people less than 100 years ago. If we could do that then, we're certainly capable of overcoming obstacles facing us today. I don't want to dog on the media because I think national media is very important. I'm a daily newspaper reader. I subscribe to several news magazines as well. But when you watch the 6 o'clock news, when you watch the 5 o'clock news, when you watch the 11 o'clock news, and they're trying to condense all the most important information into just 30 minutes. It does seem like the most important information they choose, it's pretty bad stuff, right? And if you want to view the world, if you want to view our nation as a debt-ridden, violent atmosphere, there is evidence out there that you could build to make that case. But I think when you walk around and you open your eyes and you experience actual life around us, things aren't nearly as bad as we're sometimes being led to believe they are. I mean, people tell me all the time, like, I can't believe you work downtown every day. It's gone to hell over the last 10 years. No, it hasn't. Like, everything is fine. I walk around downtown all the time. Do bad things occasionally happen downtown? Yes, they do. But when I was an undergraduate here 25 years ago, did bad things occasionally happen downtown? Yes, they did. Right? So I would say pay closer attention to what you're experiencing, and sometimes less to what you're hearing. Recognize that collectively as a nation, we've been able to overcome tremendous things before. And, if you're really scared that a Trump victory means the end of democracy, well, the United States does have some pretty powerful safeguards in place to help guard against that. And if you're worried that a Kamala victory means the rise of American communism, rest assured, the Democratic Party looks nothing like the Communist Party of Lenin or Stalin or Mao or Ho or any of them.
Or any of them, right?
Because it's not communism.
Right. And this is something that we've briefly talked about, but as a historian, right now out there's a sentiment in this country that this is the most divided that we've ever been. And then there's a couple of comedians who have wisely said, right, guys, but the Civil War.
Right.
But
we
the Civil War.
We did fight this big thing called the Civil War.
What is your reaction? Did you roll your eyes at that statement at this point? Is it more of an annoying thing, or is it discouraging? Like, what is the emotion that you have attached to hearing that statement?
Sure. To some degree, it is an eye roll, but often, I mean, sometimes it depends on the situation. When I'm in the classroom, there's a very easy way to respond to that because it's my classroom. So
Right.
I just, open up a discussion to demonstrate how we do seem very divided right now, and in some ways we are. we can definitely look at instances in the American past when we were more divided than this. The obvious one, as you already mentioned, being the American Civil War. And when you look at it in that light, we are so far from the circumstances that they were experiencing in the 1850s and the lead up to 1861. If anything, I would say our times compare more favorably with like 1967 to 1972, about that 5-year span in there when you've got these great social upheavals that are causing differences and political realignments, and you've got international affairs that are causing domestic upheavals and political realignment, and you've got economic issues at play that are causing upheavals and political realignment. And as divided as we got in that period, nothing compared to the 1860s once again. And it's also worth mentioning, division to some degree is a good thing. We shouldn't all have the same values. We shouldn't. The point of a free society is free thought and free action and free press and free speech and freedom of expression. And how free is it if we're all just dittoing one another all the time? Now, that being said, some of the calls of violence that we've heard over the last few months some of the acts of violence, the act of violence that we saw unfold in Butler over the summer, obviously that's cause for concern, but there was a lot of violent rhetoric in the 60s and 70s too, and there were violent actions in the 60s and 70s. Kent State, University of New Mexico, the Hard Hat Rebellion in New York City, Jackson State in Mississippi, right? Like violence, we often, because we celebrate the peacefulness of the civil rights movement so much, we often forget that there's a lot of violence during that period as well.
Yeah. What does the set, because I think there's a certain sentiment behind that statement. And I think maybe it comes from the place that the American people know that they're divided on certain things, but they feel kind of helpless to stop it. And then, does that lead somebody down the road that, okay, we're divided, we're kind of helpless to stop it. This has a breaking point at some time. And that's whenever I think people say, oh, are we closer to another civil war? That's kind of whenever that question, I think, gets brought up. And what do you think about that? Because that's another thing you've mentioned is you've heard more students in recent years ask you, are we closer to a civil war?
That's true. I've been asked that both in Kansas before I came back to Pittsburgh, and since I've come back to Pittsburgh. It is a question that I hear more and more from my conservative students, from my liberal students, from my cinema students, from my history students. It is on people's minds. To some degree, that's understandable when you look at the way gun violence has grown in our society, especially over your generation's lifetime. It does seem like there's a lot of people in this country who don't want to talk things out anymore, who don't want to compromise. They want to make their point through the barrel of a gun. And that in turn, if they're willing to do it, at Kenosha, Wisconsin, and they're willing to do it at Sandy Hook Elementary, and they're willing, why won't they be willing to do it in the wake of an election that doesn't go the way they want it to go? On the other hand, that kind of unified action the Civil War, I don't want to say everybody saw it coming, because no, not everybody saw it coming, but it was, there are years of warnings officially from state legislatures like, hey, we're going to hold secession conferences. There's calling out of state militias. And it was so regionalized in the 1860s in a way that it's not today. Now, in some ways, you can look at things like social media making it easier to unify those kinds of movements, I suppose. But But I have a hard time wrapping my head around the idea that in the wake of this election, we're gonna fall into that kind of violence against one another. I just find it hard to believe. I find it hard to believe that there are enough diehard conservatives that are willing to kill their fellow Americans if things don't go their way in a week, and I find the exact opposite just as hard to believe. Could there be a handful of radicals that perform radical acts in the wake of this election? Yes, I mean I think we could see that, but you have that potential after any election, really.
Right. On a similar note, there are people out there, and I think I've heard this. I think I've heard this said about every single election that I've been conscious for, which is 3, really. But there's a sentiment that that this is the most important election that has ever been voted on in the history of the species and the entire planet and all of the civilization. Is there any merit to that? To this one being any uniquely more important than 2020, for example, or 2016?
Yeah, no, Carson, you raised a great point. I think the only election cycle where I didn't hear that argument was the 2001, right? Like or I should say yeah, because I've been, yeah. Because 2004, this was the most important election. We had to take power away from the warmongering. Well, that didn't work, right? But then 4 years later, 2008 was the most important election because we had an opportunity to make history and show how the United States has grown in its acceptance. And then 2012, we have to defend Obamacare. And then 2000. So no, you're right. We have definitely fallen into this rhetorical pattern of declaring every election to be the most important one. I suppose one of the advantages of that is that, I mean, people are way more engaged than they used to be, and you see it in the numbers. We had the nation had a very strong turnout in 2000. It seems like this turnout's going to be even. 2020 rather, and it looks like the 2024 turnout's going to be even higher. So arguing that the stakes of every election are really high has had the added benefit of greater engagement with the electorate.
Are those people engaging for the right reason?
Is there a wrong reason to engage in the democratic process?
That's a good question. That's a good point. I guess I'm just thinking, do you always want the people to be voting out of fear?
Well, that's a good question. That is but the apathy which plagued the United States elections for a long time
is just as bad,
right? So
agreed.
I do agree. People should vote out of conviction. They should vote out of patriotism. They should vote out of a sense of civic duty. I do think voting is a civic duty. I think it's really the one of the only 2 things that we are called upon as American citizens to actually do, right? We're supposed to pay our taxes and we're supposed to vote. Otherwise, there is nothing we're really required to do as American citizens. But even then, the voting thing is obviously taxes aren't an option. If you don't vote those, you're going to pay the price for that eventually. If you don't vote, nobody's ever gonna fine you or punish you for that. But when you think about the history of voting in this country and the struggle and the way people have fought and the efforts and I don't just mean people that fought in the wars defending democracy, or however we want to define World War I and World War II. Politically, they were defined as saving democracy, but the African Americans and their allies who struggled to win voting rights in Reconstruction and then the Civil Rights Movement, the millions of women who struggled for generations to win the right to vote, even the voting rights of white men, which obviously they've had the most voting rights for the longest time, but that was a fight too. For the first 50, 60 years of our country, there wasn't even any universal white male suffrage. A lot of people have fought really hard to get our country to the point where everyone has the right to engage in this process, and that's part of why I think it's. I feel like I've gotten a little off track though.
No, it's okay.
From where we started on this question.
It is. You make an interesting point. It is interesting how foreign conflicts that we fight are to save democracy, like wars for civilization, that kind of thing. But anytime there was any of that stuff at home, I don't think that any of those were ever labeled as a fight for democracy, despite the fact that it's probably in the short term, in the immediate, that's more of a fight for democracy than maybe that conflict over the sea is, even though there's both problems, but it's like one of them is affecting you directly right here at home right now.
Right. Yes, no, and this was a strong argument that both the African American suffrage movement and the women's suffrage movement made again and again. Like, how can you say we're fighting for democracy in Europe when we don't even have democracy in St. Louis or Atlanta or yeah. So it is a very good point. Is this election the most important one? To get back to your original question.
Yeah.
I mean, I hear all the rhetoric, and sometimes I hear it. And I mean, look, Carson, in class, we just covered fascism a couple weeks ago, right? And at no point did I make any comparisons to anybody running in this election. But there were certainly people in the classroom who were like, well, what you're describing sounds a lot like certain things that are... So I understand why some people want to use that label to describe certain aspects of the MAGA movement. I also understand how the MAGA movement is able to take that boy who cried wolf and turn it against those who are crying fascism at the same time, because in 2004 everybody was saying George Bush was a fascist. And now people are like, oh, if only we could have Bush again. Well, wait, if he was a fascist in 2000, so it can be a tricky thing when the political opposition throws that kind of term. And again, we have the exact opposite situation the other way. When Republicans start labeling every liberal or every progressive as a communist, like, at some point it's going to lose its weight as well. That being said, Project 2025, there are some really disconcerting aspects to it. And candidate Trump has verbally distanced himself from the 2025 project. Anybody that's paying attention also knows that there are people that were deeply involved in the 2025 project that are also deeply involved in his campaign and presumably in his transition of power and his executive department should he win next week. On the other hand, as I already mentioned, I have a lot of faith in our democratic institutions. We have a lot of really strong courts. I have a very hard time believing that the United States military would just blindly follow orders if the ask went too far. I don't think the military would act in violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. I think Trump would have a very difficult time getting protesters labeled as a domestic threat to enact the force bill. So, but that being said, if you feel in your gut like this is a really important election and you need to participate, by all means, follow that gut feeling.
Sure.
Vote.
During times like this where the nation is really polarized, or maybe you're right, maybe it's not even really polarized. This is my question though is this the work of something like the perception gap, where we think that we are much more divided than we really are? Like, when you go out in everyday life, does it seem like it's as bad as social media tells you that it is?
No, I think that's a great point. And we can look at it as a perception gap. We can also look at it as, I think I've heard it described as a recency bias as well.
Yes.
Like, because it's happening right now, it is so important right now. And again, this is where historical perspective can be a relief, because, well, yes, right now does feel very important because we're in it. But when we just take a step back and breathe, we can, I was at the Steelers game on Monday night, right? And like, I am sure not everyone sitting around me shared my political views, but for 3.5 hours, it didn't make any difference. Nobody cared. When I'm in Target or Shop and Save, it doesn't seem to make any difference. When I get annoyed at people in traffic, I don't care what their politics are. I'm annoyed at, So in that sense, yes, I do think that when we can set aside our political divides, we see that the cultural and social ties that bind us together are still really strong. But, people politics is really strange right now, you know?
Very.
I mean, obviously the United States has always had a winner-take-all political system, but it just feels like recently, and again, this could just be the recency bias that I just spoke of, and now I am myself falling right into it. But it just seems, I mean, when George Bush was reelected in 2004, I mean, I was disappointed, but I wasn't crushed. And the idea that I was going to go out and raise hell because my guy lost was absurd, right? And I think most people, I know most conservatives reacted the exact same way after Obama was elected in 2008. They were disappointed. They were hoping that their guy McCain was going to take it, but they were like, okay, well, let's...
Time to retool and see if we can win the next one.
Yeah, and instead of this knee-jerk reaction where we just immediately have to cast aspersions, delegitimize the victory, it's I don't want to say it's like we've fanboyed out politics these days, but in some ways it feels like that.
That's an
It
amazing...
feels like all the
yes.
passion we used to invest in the Steelers and the Pirates and the Penguins, and the idea that, oh my God, if the Steelers don't win the Super Bowl, then everything is... That has completely transitioned into our politics. And,
Yes.
And as a result, we're forgetting what the art of politics actually is, which is compromise, right? But when you fanboy out the politics this way, compromise is completely unacceptable because your
Yes.
team has to win or you're a loser.
Yeah, it's capitulation. It's
Right.
an admittance of defeat if you compromise.
Right.
Yeah. What do you think? I do agree, and this is something we talked about at some point after class. Is that to me it feels like, and maybe this is just me coming from it, like from a centrist perspective, but it feels like right now this election is not even about left versus right anymore. I see ads from both candidates saying that Trump was born rich, he's for the rich, Kamala Harris is for us. And then I see another ad which is like, Kamala doesn't care about you, she's whatever this, but Donald Trump is for you, he cares. So it seems like there's almost more of a class emphasis in some of these ads than it necessarily is on politics, because there's working class people that said I voted for Trump in 2016, 2020, now I'm voting for Kamala. I'm sure everyone knows someone where that's kind of been the situation. And like you said, like the whole thing, it just feels very weird. Like Dick Cheney is on the campaign trail.
And there are Democrats that are like,
Kamala
the
Harris,
idea...
and the Democrats are touting this. And to me, it just to me, all that seems like is because he's bought out, right? He spent years in the world of politics.
Yeah.
He was the guy for the military-industrial complex for so long.
Well, and for Democrats for 8 years, he was an even bigger villain than... I mean, people are like,
Right.
George Bush isn't even president. He's just a puppet of Cheney and Rumsfeld and blah. And now we're like, we got Cheney on our side. It's definitely a strange thing. And
What is happening?
And RFK Jr., well, I mean, granted, RFK Jr. has been unique for a long time.
But either way, someone that considered themselves a lifelong Democrat.
Yeah.
Same thing with Andrew Yang, although I don't think nearly as controversial as RFK Jr. is, but people like that have left, and now it feels like there's no lines anymore. This is a weird election of like class and establishment versus not establishment, whatever you want to call that, populism, whatever it is, is there any historical context that can help us
Yeah,
here?
no,
So
I mean,
we
I
need
think there
something.
is. I think there actually is some really good historical comparison that we can make, and I think it's really to the 1904. Hold on, 1902 election. So McKinley's killed, Roosevelt takes over. Roosevelt is the Republican. He's running against William Jennings Bryan, the Democrat. But both of them are trying to infuse their platform with populist progressive ideas, in order to try to win over these really disaffected voters that have drifted away from the standard party system, right? And so you have this weird thing where in that election cycle, it's the parties are making not the exact same arguments, but they're making very similar arguments, and making very similar accusations against one another, as to which one is the party that really cares about the American people, which one is really trying to serve the American people and not just business and corporate interests. And then of course the progressive movement it sputters out and it burns out. And Teddy Roosevelt will end up being pretty disillusioned by what he feels like is the Republican abandonment of his progressive platform. But I do think it serves as an interesting point of comparison to what we're looking at today, because there's no doubt there is this working class, middle class. I mean, obviously, we've gone more and more towards a service-based economy,
Yes.
and service-based employment, but nonetheless, there remains these blue-collar construction jobs, electricians, carpenters. Trade people make nice money to establish them in the middle class, but they're definitely working class, middle class individuals. And I think a lot of their votes are which for decades Democrats have taken for granted are up in the air right now when we see the Republicans, who are traditionally obviously the party of business and big money, trying to make a play for those voters, arguing that your best interests no longer lie with the Democrats. And so you can really see the way it lines up with the Roosevelt William Jennings Bryan election.
If we were to do a historical analysis right now of the two-party system, what grade does it get? Using the Point Park grading system.
I won't make it. You almost got me. I mean, on the one hand,
What has it gotten right and what has it gotten wrong?
it has survived since 1793.
That's impressive,
And
as it is.
that is something to be said, right? And when you look at the other major two-party system in the world, which is the United Kingdom, they have survived with their two-party parliamentary system even longer than we have. So if Great Britain and the United States are the models of functional representative government over the longue durée, they have both made it work with the two-party system. So something is right about it,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
I suppose part of what's right about it, when it's a winner-take-all system, it does force some of these minor, more radical parties to reconcile with the fact pretty early on, we're never going to win over a big chunk of the American electorate. So we have two choices. We can either continue to hold to be ideologically pure, to hold to our principles. We are going to be the Green Party, and that is what we are, and we're not going to compromise. And even though we're never even going to get 3% of the popular vote, we're going to run a candidate every single election cycle because that's what we believe in. Or the American Socialist Party, or whatever it might be. Those obviously exist in a two-party system, but they don't ever really get anywhere. what is more successful in a two-party system is when someone who is attracted to the ideas of maybe the Green Party recognizes, I'm not getting in with the Green Party, but what I might be able to do is build a basis of support for Green Party ideas within the Democratic Party. And the two-party system automatically creates much wider umbrellas for the electorate than a multi-party parliamentary, apportionment system like you see in France or Italy.
Yep.
So many of the parliamentary systems around the world are built off that. And I mean, one of the reasons that we do see the rise of fascism in European parliamentary systems in the 1920s and 1930s is simply because of that. The National Socialist Party of Germany gets 10% of votes, well, it gets 10% of the seats. And from there, it can build its power base more and more and more.
But an extreme faction of either one of the two parties here at home would not be able to get maybe that far, because even if that extreme faction represents 10% of that half, you have to go through the rest of your party first.
Exactly.
And maybe that's why the way that Donald Trump just took over the party like that is so concerning, is because maybe that's not supposed to happen in the ideal scenario.
Right. We really only have one other example of a politician being able to transform a political party in this country so quickly,
overnight,
so thoroughly,
yeah,
and largely through the cult of personality. And that's Andrew Jackson, right? Even FDR, in his transformation of the Democrats through New Deal democracy, it wasn't nearly the transformation that we see Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump have on their respective parties in the 1820s and the 2000 and teens. So yeah, you're right. And I think you really nailed it. That is one of the great strengths of the two-party system. It keeps extremism in check to a large degree. But when you have these I suppose demagogic is a little bit strong, but these really strong personalities that believe in very strongman government, and they attract a certain kind of voter. It can be disruptive, and to be fair, this was something that from the very beginning, when you read the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers, this was one of the big discussions they had with the ratification of the Constitution. Could some kind of demagogue command a cult of personality and bend all of these odd rules in such a way that they can completely undo the safety designed by the system? Yeah. So no, I mean, you make a very good point.
How has the legacy of the two parties and their vision for what this country is supposed to be changed over time?
Well, I guess we can start with the Republican Party because it's younger.
Sure.
Right? The Republican Party is only founded in 1852. Hold on. 1854 in Ripon, Wisconsin, with the collapse of the American Whig Party. So from the beginning, there are aspects of the Republican Party today that still tie it into its very founding. From the beginning of its creation, the Republicans wanted to be the party of business interests, and they have largely maintained that through their existence. They have strong ties to the corporate and business world. They believe that the government shouldn't be over-involved in monitoring and regulating corporations. It's something they've always really stuck to. The party of morality is another way the Republicans have often positioned themselves, and that's sort of a through line that has carried them. They established themselves as the anti-slavery party in 1854, not just politically but morally. Like this is morally wrong, and we need to start working to undo it. And the Republicans never, I mean, there are times when they got a little bit weaker on the morale. To be fair, during the Gilded Age, everybody was weak on morality. So,
Yes.
so, but we see it crop up again. Now, to be fair, some of the things they were arguing as moral in the 1950s and 1960s are things today that we'd be like, well, that's completely immoral, right? But nonetheless, they believed that they were and then in the 1980s we see Reagan really come into a full alliance with what was known as the moral majority at the time, and that continues with the close relationship between MAGA and American evangelicalism, and Republicans trying still to position themselves as the more moral of the two parties, right? Their anti-trans stance is built on their claims of traditional American morality. Their anti-abortion stance is built on their claims of traditional American morality. Their willingness to undo the progress of the gay rights movement is built around their... So in that sense, the Republican Party has always sort of had that through line to it. What has changed about the Republican Party? Well, I mean, they were the party that was going to end slavery, right? They were the party of abolitionists. They were the party of radical progressivism, tied in with business interests when they were initially founded. And one of the things that Teddy Roosevelt tries to do in the early 1900s is capture that essence of the Republican Party again. Be like, guys, we're drifting away from this idea. Like, we're saying we're moral, but we're really moving away from beliefs in equality. We're moving away from beliefs in treating people the way that we want to be treated. And I would say that, he largely lost that fight. And then under the New Deal first, but then with Nixon's Southern strategy, you have the complete reversal in the Republican Party and their view on race progress, on equality, on those kinds of issues. They've also gotten to be much bigger believers in small government. The Republican Party believed in federal government intervention. In fact, the Republican Party is largely responsible for creating the 14th and 15th Amendments, which really expands the role the federal government plays in our everyday lives. And today, obviously, the Republican Party, and for decades, the Republican Party has argued that it's the party of small government. Presumably, that argument still exists within the Republican Party. Fiscal conservancy, that's a more difficult one. The Republicans, when they're founded, never really claimed to be fiscal conservatives. That argument develops more and more with the New Deal, right? Like, FDR has the New Deal, spending all this money, following Keynesian economics. Well, the reaction against that is the government spending should be kept to an absolute minimum. Fiscal conservancy, that's the way. And they've beat that drum, and they continue to beat that drum. But the evidence that says they're actually fiscally conservative is very, very questionable. The Democratic Party is older, right? The Democratic Party is one of the first two parties founded. It's the party of Thomas Jefferson originally. It believes in national expansion, mostly isolationism, and an agrarian society. Obviously, that does not reflect the priorities of the Democrats today in any way. Although, to be fair, does either party really speak for agrarian America? I mean, I know rural Americans largely rally around the conservative voting movement, but I mean, have you heard anything about farming policy at all this election cycle?
No,
None. It's like it's crazy. They don't
Yeah.
even talk about it But some of the
No.
things we're not talking anyway. The Democrats undergo several different changes. Up until the Civil War, they are the party that believes that the government should not intervene that the government shouldn't be involved in interfering with states. They're the big party of states' rights, and they continue to be the party of states' rights after the Civil War as well. That doesn't really change. But as we were already discussing, with the progressive movement, both parties are sort of put into a crisis of identity, and the Democrats end up emerging from that, adopting more of a working class mentality, more of a pro-union mentality. The racial open-mindedness of Democrats is still longer in developing, right? Democrats spend a long time giving lip service into the belief of racial equality, but they don't really do a whole lot to put their money where their mouth is until the 1950s, 1960s. But FDR creates New Deal democracy. It's expanding government programs. It's creating a greater social safety net. It's working towards greater economic and political and educational equality in the United States. And even though New Deal democracy isn't really around anymore, I do think in a lot of ways, classic traditional Democrats still hang their hats on a lot of those beliefs of New Deal democracy. But yeah, the parties, they change, they go through different permutations, and it's fascinating to study as a historian as we evolve from the first party system all the way up until today, which the sixth party system, at least the seventh party system. I mean, I think it's fair to argue that Trump and the MAGA movement has redefined American politics enough that we are moving into a new, if we're not already in it, into a new party system.
Yeah, because now we have the Republican Party is taking an isolationist stance. The Democrat Party is doing the opposite.
Right.
Although I guess both parties are still kind of in support of giving support to Israel in varying capacities.
Yeah, well, even the whole Israel thing is really it's a strange thing. They've flipped on so many issues. They've completely flipped sides. No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. The idea, even 20 years ago, that Republicans will be looking upon the war in Ukraine with disdain is just mind-boggling. Like, Republicans, they were looking for any war 20 years ago, right?
They would have been checking if Ukraine had oil.
Right, yeah.
What do you think the legacy of Joe Biden's presidency will be?
I don't know.
How do you think we're going to remember Biden?
I think a lot of that depends on what happens next week, to be perfectly honest with you.
It's a very good point, because if Trump wins, then they will hang him.
Yeah.
Metaphorically, right?
He's going to be the new Jimmy Carter for at least the next 2 decades.
And he won't be around at that.
He won't be around, unlike Jimmy Carter, who stuck
right.
around and was able to rehabilitate his reputation.
I think we should... Is he on the ticket?
I think 100 is a little too old to run.
No, I don't think so, Dr. Wolf.
100 in brain cancer, I think maybe excludes you from... But he did vote. I don't know if you saw that, but he did. He went to the polls and he cast his ballot early. Just in case he didn't make it to November 5th.
Right.
Well, because we've been told how many times in the last year, this is it. Jimmy Carter's in hospice. He'll be dead in a few hours. And then they're like, oh, and now it's his 99th birthday. Now it's his 100th birthday.
Right.
It's impressive.
And if Harris wins next week, then Biden will, because the whole narrative whenever he left was that this was graceful, this was a brave thing to do, this was the right thing to do. This is he is putting party over, or a country over party, or whatever it was. If Harris wins, then he will be viewed as this will be a heroic thing. It's like he will be. So I guess it's right. His reputation,
especially if she has a good presidency. I mean, she wins, her next 4 years, her 8 years,
or whatever it is,
whatever it might be, are steady. Things sort of level out, and 12 years, we could be looking back going, man, he was a springboard for a new age of prosperity, all starting with Build America Better or Build America, whatever the infrastructure plan is called.
Build Back Better.
Build Back Better. If she loses and Donald Trump wins, yeah, I mean, I think for Trumpists, Biden was a failed presidency from the day he was sworn in.
Maybe even before that. Maybe even as soon as he got the nomination, it was
right.
like, well, this is it.
Right. And so all we're going to hear for the next 4 years, any problem that might be encountered over the next 4 years is not going to be the fault of the Trump administration. It's all going to be because of the incompetence of that low IQ Joe Biden.
Like, yeah, because I feel like Obama got blamed. He still might be getting blamed for stuff that it's like, I don't even know how.
Now, to be fair, every administration does this to some point, right? Every administration comes and goes, well, of course I'm having trouble dealing with the economy. Look at the mess that Schmo left me, right?
Yeah.
But we historically, you can look back and you can see there are some presidents that are being handed a pretty nice situation, and there are other presidents who are being handed here's a bag of mess. Figure it out.
Yeah.
Figure it out. I mean,
Obama
comes in and I mean immediately he has to deal with the collapse of American housing and banking.
Right. Yeah.
And I know a lot of progressives were disappointed in Obama, and I get that to some degree. I mean, he ran on this story and this message of hope and change, and it seemed like once he got into office, it was a lot of the same stuff that had, where was the change? Where the wars didn't. I mean, I'm not trying to dog Obama, but the man won a Nobel Peace Prize. For what? For what? I mean, it's not called I'm not the George W. Bush Prize. It's called the Nobel Peace Prize.
Right.
And while I think Obama did some really admirable things, he was something of a warmonger, right? And he stepped up our use of drone warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan in a way that had not occurred under the previous administration. I mean, but that's just about the Nobel Peace Prize.
Right.
He's handed this financial mess that he really does have to tackle right away that pulls focus from any other agenda he might have had of his own when he was actually running for president and trying to. And so I do think we can see in some administrations they're gifted a really nice situation, and others have a little bit of an albatross around their neck. I suppose I have certain biases. I think whoever wins next week is coming into a fairly stable situation. Inflation is under control. The economy continues to add jobs month after month after month after month. Whatever you might hear about bounce back jobs, these aren't bounce back jobs. If bounce back jobs were so easy, then why is employment still so down in Great Britain, right? Obviously, you've got some foreign affairs that are a little bit tricky. Whether you're Kamala or Donald, you've got some foreign affairs that there's no easy answer to, and I don't envy either one of them that situation. But I think domestically, they're both being handed a pretty stable situation. So, but again, if he wins, I don't think that'll be part of Biden's legacy moving forward. It won't be he spent 4 years solidifying things and preparing well for the next administration. If Trump wins, it's not going to be that it's so.
No. How have these campaigns that are being run in this election different from previous ones? Because obviously media now is much more involved. I mean, they're doing TikToks, they're going on podcasts. I reached out to both of them to do this show, and
what?
Can you believe that I didn't get a response?
Did you tell them I was going to be on? Because Kamala texts me like every day right now.
No, they text me all the time as well, and they say, "Hey man, vote for me." The crypto lobby texts me, the vaping lobby texts me,
Well,
and they want
you
my
keep all their
vote.
flyers. That's why.
Yeah, right. I've put up the flyers. I vape, I vote. I put it up in my apartment. So what's the difference here? What are the big differences? And then we're gonna have to wrap up here in a few minutes.
Sure,
But what are the big ones that we're looking at?
I mean, I can't believe there was only one debate. It's
Right.
It's mind-boggling. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess you could say there were two, if you count the Biden Trump debate.
Yeah.
But the debate cycle is so. I mean, I can't believe it.
They should be debating every month. I mean, should they genuinely not be doing a debate like once a month?
At the very least, they should have had. I mean, I can understand with the switch of candidates if the Trump camp wanted to be like, we're not doing a full slate of three. We already gave you one. You get two more. Three is a tradition, and
Right.
three is what we're sticking with. And if he had said we're only going to do one more, I could have understood that.
Right.
But they didn't even do one more, right? That traditional town hall debate just never happened, and I think it's a shame. I think a third debate would have served the American people really well. Yeah, the social media, the podcasting. I mean, like when some of the most compelling interviews you're getting in the presidential cycle are coming from Joe Rogan and Howard Stern, I think something's a little. I mean, but now I sound like a fuddy-duddy, right? Like, I can't believe they're not on ABC and CBS. And
No, but you make a good point, though. I made this point to you at some point during class. Like, how is it that I'm listening to a podcast with a presidential candidate? It's better than any interview I've heard from them in the corporate media since this guy came onto the political scene. Comedians are doing a better job at interviewing him.
I mean, part of it is the freedom of the podcast platform,
Yes.
right? Like, Rogan or Stern can have Trump or Kamala on for an hour and a half or 2 hours, and it can be a freewheeling conversation, far different from when you're doing a segment for 2020 or 60 Minutes or Fox News or whatever it might be. So I think the freedom of that format does have, but not everybody subscribes to Joe Rogan, right?
That's true, right.
And what is still good about those traditional ABC, CBS, NBC, PBS interviews is that they're still broadcast television. Everybody gets them for free, whether they've cable cut or not. The accessibility, I think, is what makes those still more important. And I guess in a disappointing way, newspapers just don't make any difference anymore.
Yeah.
And it's sad.
It is sad.
Because I still think the best coverage that we're getting of this election are largely coming from the newspapers. But they don't move the needle.
Not like they used to.
Especially not with voters under the age of 40.
No. What is, I guess, and this will maybe be how we conclude here. This is kind of a crazy way to wrap it up because we could have talked for an hour about this alone. But one of the big things that I've seen, another one of those big things just that I've seen, and I've been thinking about this, like, I don't think it matters who wins. Somebody is going to say that there was voter fraud or that there were ballot boxes being stuffed or that certain people were put in places of influence to ratify or to not ratify the election. From what I understand, voter fraud does happen in every election, but it's not enough to overturn the numbers.
Right.
Now, in an ideal world, right, we obviously would have no voter fraud. Ideally, you would have none. I guess my question is, historically, what has this country done to fight that? Like, at a certain point, you're putting in, the question is, like, how many resources do you pour into making sure that, for example, 1,000 fraudulent votes aren't put into the whole mix, right? Because eventually you could be spending how many resources to prevent 1,000, right? Like fraudulent votes. Now that could affect an individual election, but just, I guess, broadly, like how has that problem been handled? And is it something that, again, because if there isn't compelling evidence for the numbers being large enough to overturn an election, is it something that deserves as big of a piece of the national conversation as it's getting?
That is a great question. I think voter fraud is it's a false flag. It's smoke and mirrors. It is not a real issue, and I believe that because I've been paying attention to the voter fraud studies that have been conducted, largely in conservative areas and by conservative think tanks. Georgia just did a complete review of its voter rolls, and what they turn up 80 people out of millions and millions of millions who were improperly registered to vote. The Heritage Foundation has done, which is one of the most famous conservative think tanks.
Which they wrote Project 2025.
They're one of the main authors of Project 2025. They have done one of the most extensive voter fraud investigations in the country, thinking they were going to turn out a big problem. And what their study has demonstrated is, I believe it's 0.08% of the electorate falsely casts their votes.
And that's from the Heritage
Foundation. So like this isn't a real issue now historically it has been an issue, right? There was a time in this country when voter fraud was much easier and much more widespread, and that is some of the reasons that we have the structures and the strictures around voting that we have today, with registering and getting voter ID cards and having state issued IDs and checking in, 3 levels of clearance before you actually walk into the voter booth. I mean, there's all kinds of systems that we've put in place because voter fraud used to be a problem. But it's really not anymore. And I just think it plays well. And you can always turn out evidence, right? There's always dead people who vote in every election. Ever since we moved to an early voting platform, when people can vote as early as 6 weeks before the election, people die in 6 weeks, right? And that doesn't mean that their vote was cast illegally. It doesn't mean that that election integrity is under assault. It's just biologically these things happen sometimes. I also think that we ask a lot of immigrants in this country to keep track of everything they're allowed to do when they're allowed to do it all the time. And I think some people do illegally register to vote, but I often think it's born out of innocence and ignorance. I mean, think about it. You go to the DMV, they ask you if you want to vote, if you want to register to vote. You go to the post office, they ask you if you want to register to vote. You go to college, they ask you if you want to register to vote.
Every guy on the street.
Every guy on the street for months asks you if you want to register to vote. And it's understandable that maybe somebody doesn't quite understand how the registration process actually works in this country, and they just go ahead with it. One of the really famous cases of voter fraud in Florida recently, the person registered, they were a felon, and they got out of prison, and they were told that they had done everything, that even their parole officer said, "You are now cleared to register to vote." And so she does, but it turns out she was actually registered 6 months early, and now gets arrested for voter fraud. And it's like, well, I mean...
Yeah.
So does it happen? Yes. Is it an issue that is affecting our elections? Absolutely not. It's not. And I think we're wasting energy on it. I think we're allowing ourselves to be gaslit by it. There's so many more productive conversations we could be having.
All right, well, we're at time.
Okay.
We got to wrap up. But I appreciate you stopping in and chatting with me today.
Always a pleasure.
It was a great time. I've already enjoyed it. Thank you all for watching.